Welcome back to our show, now CEO of our country's art choice. We'll delve into that a bit later, but first, I'd like to get an update on Ukraine since our last conversation. It's becoming increasingly evident to the average person that things aren't going well for the West, especially. I'm curious about the death toll in Ukraine, including both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. I've heard estimates ranging from 50,000 to 500,000. I understand you lean towards the higher end of the spectrum. Can you help us make sense of these numbers? You know, analysts have been trying to piece this puzzle together. Some of the analysts I rely on have been meticulously reviewing sources, including death notices, obituaries, and cemetery expansions. These sources are often in Ukrainian and Russian, so you need someone fluent in both languages, and I have access to such expertise. By examining these sources, we can estimate the scale of the tragedy. Furthermore, space-based imagery of cemeteries shows significant expansions to accommodate an estimated 150,000 dead. This is a clear indication that the death toll is substantial. Additionally, we consider various reports from the field. Surprisingly, the Russians have been somewhat transparent in their assessments. In some instances, we've concluded that Putin and other Russian officials might have downplayed the numbers, underreporting Ukrainian casualties. Russian losses, on the other hand, have been consistently modest. While there have been a few days with higher casualties, overall, their numbers have remained relatively low throughout the war. Russian casualties, including killed in action, likely number fewer than 100,000. In fact, the Russians may have lost as few as 35,000 killed in action. Turning to the Ukrainian side, the situation is more challenging to assess. Ukrainian experts have been diligently analyzing all available information, combining data from overhead imagery with other sources. The prevailing consensus suggests that the death toll among Ukrainians falls within the range of 450,000 to 500,000. However, the exact number of wounded remains uncertain. A key distinction between the wounded on the Russian side and those on the Ukrainian side is the extent of their injuries. This is where a profound difference emerges. While the Russians have maintained relatively low casualty figures, many of those wounded on the Ukrainian side have suffered more severe injuries. This aspect of the conflict highlights the profound toll it has taken on the Ukrainian armed forces and their personnel. So, to summarize, when we try to make sense of the staggering numbers, we consider various sources, including death notices, obituaries, cemetery expansions, and satellite imagery. While the Russian side has generally been forthright about their casualties, the Ukrainian side relies on careful analysis, and the consensus now points to a death toll ranging from 450,000 to 500,000, with significant numbers of wounded. This disparity between wounded Russian and Ukrainian soldiers underscores the immense impact of the conflict on Ukraine. It's truly heart-wrenching to see the suffering in Ukraine, and the casualties, especially among Ukrainians, are deeply distressing. One stark difference is the severity of injuries sustained by Ukrainians compared to Russian soldiers. What's even more tragic is that Ukraine lacks the capacity to evacuate the wounded promptly. In many cases, it has become so dire that Ukrainian officers or soldiers who are severely wounded resort to bribing those driving ambulances just to get to a proper hospital for treatment. It's a stark reminder of the corruption issues that have plagued Ukraine for some time, but the situation during wartime takes it to a whole new level. If I may add, all these factors paint a grim picture of the situation in Ukraine. The war seems to be effectively over, with the Russians not only holding the strategic initiative but also boasting a substantial force of approximately 1 million troops. Around 750,000 are stationed in southern and surrounding Ukraine, and that number is expected to rise to about 1.2 million as they continue to deploy more troops. Now, the big question is, why haven't the Russians launched a full-scale attack? There are two key reasons for this. Firstly, the Ukrainians have essentially played into the hands of the Russians by relentlessly attacking them. The Ukrainians have, in many instances, thrown themselves at what are essentially impregnable Russian defenses. If your enemy is making such a grave mistake, it's in your best interest not to interrupt them. So, in a way, the Russians have benefited from the Ukrainians' ill-conceived defensive actions. Secondly, the Russians maintain a significant advantage in terms of surveillance across Ukraine. Their space-based intelligence surveillance reconnaissance capabilities, while narrowly focused on Ukraine, provide them with a comprehensive view of the country. They can see everything happening on the ground and have the ability to strike any target whenever they see fit. As a result, they haven't felt a pressing need to launch a major offensive. There's a growing sense that President Putin, who has been in discussions with his top generals, is inching closer to the decision to allow this massive force to push forward. The question then becomes, what does move forward mean in this context? Contrary to some perceptions, Putin has never expressed a desire to march his troops all the way to the Polish border. Instead, his concern lies more with the West's unwillingness to engage in meaningful negotiations. The more resistance and opposition Russia encounters from Western nations on the negotiation front, the more land they feel compelled to seize. As a result, we can anticipate that they will likely take control of Kiev and eventually cross the river to seize Odessa. These cities have strong historical ties to Russia and were never originally part of Ukraine. So, the situation continues to evolve, and we need to closely monitor the developments in this complex and devastating conflict. The primary concern right now revolves around the urgency of reaching an agreement to clarify if we, along with the Europeans, or even if it's solely the Europeans without us, fail to do so, the Russians might decide to take matters into their own hands. They could advance towards the river, possibly even into Kiev, which would pose significant questions about who will engage in negotiations with them. The Russians are not eager to push further west, as they are well aware that historically, Western Ukraine holds a different sentiment. The people in Western Ukraine have resisted being ruled by the Russians, and the Russians, in turn, have no desire to exert control over them. What they are seeking is some form of arrangement for the remaining portion of Ukraine, as long as that segment is not part of NATO, ideally remains neutral, and allows for Russian influence in a limited way. They wouldn't mind what happens in Western Ukraine as long as it doesn't disrupt this arrangement. The critical question then becomes, how do we reach this stage where Western nations grasp the importance of this balance? You touched upon the fact that some in Europe are starting to realize the harsh reality. The Ukraine war has been a devastating catastrophe, nearly shattering the Ukrainian nation and causing significant economic and social damage across Europe. It's possible that this awareness could fuel demand for new leadership capable of putting an end to this war with the Russians. Unfortunately, Washington appears to be largely unresponsive in this regard. Germany, in particular, finds itself in a precarious position. It's going through a rapid process of deindustrialization, with many companies contemplating relocation. The implications are profound, given that Germany plays a vital role in Europe's economic ecosystem. Now, regarding the potential Russian advance to Odessa and the prospect of cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea, there's historical context to consider. Odessa is historically a Russian city, dating back to 1776 when Catherine the Great extended her dominion along the Black Sea in Crimea. At that time, these territories were seized from the Mongols, Tatars, and Turks. This region was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean Tatars were a vassal state of the Ottomans. Their allegiance shifted when the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire's successor, fell. The areas under discussion, including Crimea, had little that was inherently Ukrainian about them. Ukrainians were primarily situated further north in what we now refer to as Western Ukraine. This region extended up to the Dniester River and a bit further east to the Dniester River Valley. That's the extent of historic Ukraine. It's crucial to understand that the Russians aren't interested in controlling this historic Ukrainian heartland. Their objective has been to secure their own nation, safeguarding it against any potential use of Ukraine as a weapon against Russia. In many ways, they've achieved this goal. The focus now is on consolidating this accomplishment through an agreement that ensures NATO and future adversaries won't gain a foothold in Western Ukraine. What gives me some reassurance is the recent behavior of the Polish electorate. They have taken a strong stance against this war, partly due to the significant number of Ukrainians living in their country. This shift in Polish sentiment could potentially pave the way for some European consensus on the matter. But ultimately, we've reached a strategic inflection point. The pressing question is who in the West will have the courage to step up and say enough is enough and put an end to this ongoing travesty. Unfortunately, as things stand, I see no evidence of anything intelligent coming out of Washington. Regarding Washington's support, while it may appear to wane with recent approvals of a $200 million aid package, that's relatively minor compared to previous contributions. However, the key issue is that the conflict has become less of a priority for Washington, and people's interest in it will likely diminish over time. I've always maintained that the war will conclude when Washington quietly disengages from it. We might be witnessing the initial signs of this process, but it doesn't equate to a meaningful settlement or arrangement designed to restore stability to the region and finally put an end to hostilities. The underlying problem is that America, much like the British, is primarily a maritime power, and the United States, as a global aerospace power, isn't inherently geared towards being a global mediator. For us to have been so deeply involved in this conflict was always going to be a challenging endeavor. The situation we find ourselves in on the European continent is nothing short of astonishing. For 75 years, it's been remarkably anomalous. However, it appears that this unique period is drawing to a close, primarily due to our dire financial circumstances. Let's face it, we are teetering on the edge of financial implosion. Despite what the mainstream media might suggest, there's an enormous 900-pound gorilla in the room, and it goes by the name of national sovereign debt. At present, the annual payments on this national sovereign debt exceed the entire budget allocated to the United States defense, totaling roughly $1 trillion. When you include the intelligence agencies in that figure, the defense budget reaches around $850 to $820 billion. On this nearly $1 trillion expenditure is a massive burden. The critical question is, can this be sustained? Frankly, I don't believe it's sustainable. Consequently, we might find ourselves turning inward, grappling with a host of internal challenges within the United States. Moreover, we have to consider the various international engagements we are involved in. There's activity in Africa, the situation in Kosovo, the Taiwan issue, ongoing events in Armenia, and of course, the dynamics surrounding Israel. These are all aspects of how empires operate. Regarding the Taiwan matter, it's time to put the idea of a Chinese attack on Taiwan to rest. The Chinese have no genuine interest in launching an assault on Taiwan. That notion has always been baseless. What many fail to grasp is the political landscape on the island of Taiwan. Historically, there have been two prominent political parties, one pro-Japanese and the other pro-Beijing. The pro-Beijing party has gained substantial strength to the point where it's feasible that the people of Taiwan might vote for reunification with China, given the opportunity. The critical thing to understand is that there won't be a war. Both the people on Taiwan and those on the mainland have no appetite for it. The entire notion of military confrontation with Taiwan is essentially a manufactured boogeyman originating from Washington. It's high time to put this notion aside. It's a very legitimate concern, and it takes us back to a recurring pattern of foreign interventions. Often, we justify these interventions by arguing that the Europeans won't take the necessary steps. On the flip side, there have been voices in places like Great Britain and France suggesting that maybe we should let certain situations resolve themselves. But, as history shows, we typically don't heed that advice. In the case of Kosovo, we've created a rather precarious and unsustainable status quo. This arrangement can only be maintained if foreign forces are permanently stationed on the ground. However, the reality is that this status quo isn't built to last. I believe that we'll eventually pull out of Kosovo, much like we are on track to leave Bosnia and Herzegovina. European forces may follow suit in due course, and that's when we'll witness how things evolve. What's clear is that the current state of affairs isn't a stable, long-term solution. The region's dynamics will inevitably determine the outcome, and our interference only temporarily alters those dynamics. It's a bit like dipping your hand into a bucket of water. While your hand is in there, you displace the water, but as soon as you remove your hand, it's as if you were never there. This pattern repeats itself, whether it's in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, or elsewhere. This is, in my view, the beginning of the end for what's been called the American Empire. It's essential to remember that most Americans have little interest in what happens beyond their borders. We've handed over the responsibility for foreign and defense policies to a well-financed minority that harbors ambitions of global domination. The majority of Americans simply aren't concerned with these pursuits, and that's another element in this equation. When you turn your gaze to borders, you'll notice the influx of people seeking entry, coming not just from Mexico but also from places like Afghanistan and beyond. In fact, a significant portion of the Mexican population is already living within our borders, so it's questionable whether they have many more to send our way. The issues are complex, with immigration challenges, increased criminal activities, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. This situation can't continue as it is, and we are dealing with a diverse mix of people coming from Central and South America, along with the broader developing world. These dynamics are further evidence that a significant shift is underway, marking the transformation of the so-called American empire. The world as we know it today will likely look quite different in the coming decade. The situation with immigration is indeed complex, and you're absolutely right. We are seeing an influx of people not only from Mexico but also from Africa, the Caribbean basin, with a notable presence from Haiti. Additionally, there's a significant number of individuals coming from the Middle East. The real concern is the lack of proper vetting. We are left in the dark regarding who these people truly are. The part that leaves me scratching my head is that we are forking over $2,375 to each of these individuals and, to top it off, providing them with a free ticket to go anywhere in the United States they please. It's a peculiar solution that's creating quite a challenge. These folks arrive in various states and cities across the country, and given our precarious financial situation, it's putting an even heavier burden on states and cities to accommodate them. They aren't Americans, and there's a degree of uncertainty about how this can be sustained. Ben Stein's adage, "Things go on until they can't, and then they stop," seems apt here. We may well be approaching that point where the situation in the United States might come to a screeching halt. As for Israel and Gaza, the situation there is equally tumultuous. I've heard people suggest that this could be the end of Israel. The outcome really depends on how Israel handles the situation. Much like the way I've described the United States' involvement in various international issues, it also applies to Israel. We've sent 2 carrier battle groups, which is likely the extent of our direct military involvement. I don't see any compelling evidence that we'll deploy significant ground forces, even if the Israelis were to request it, which they generally don't. We simply lack the substantial ground forces needed for such operations. Sending a battalion of Marines would be a symbolic gesture rather than a game-changer in the present context. The Israeli army is mobilizing on a massive scale, amassing around 470,000 troops, including over 320,000 reservists, to deal with the situation in Gaza. The real question is, what are they going to do with this force? Right now, it appears that Israel is being guided more by emotion than reason, and that's understandable given the complex and highly charged nature of the situation.